In our last video, we talked about Mendel's law of segregation. We're going to look at what happens next when Mendel asks the question of are traits inherited separately or together? So if we look at multiple different traits, because an organism has more than one trait, are they linked somehow or are they independently inherited by each generation? Few words I need to introduce to kind of streamline our conversation. The first is the idea of genotypes. Genotypes are the actual gene expressions, the actual DNA that an organism has, whatever this codes for directly in the DNA. So the genotypes are the genes, and the phenotypes are what we see. They're the physical appearances or behaviors that are linked to definite genes. So again, the phenotypes might be tall or dwarf, and these are expressions of the underlying genes. Right, so genotype is the traits in the DNA, and this could be homozygous, heterozygous, dominant, whatever, big T, little t, big T, big T, little t. Those are all the possible genotypes. The phenotype is how it's expressed, its physical presence, and this is tall or short, in this example of the pea plant. All right, this will help our conversation because it gets a little complicated with this question. So last time, Mendel looked at what happens if I cross a violet flower with a white flower. He knows, hey, the white factor, the white trait, seems to disappear for one generation and then reappear. Well, he wondered what happens if I track two traits at once. For example, round and yellow, and yes, yellow is dominant in peas, not green. That's why it gets the big Y and green is little y. So if he knew or predicted if he crossed two pure breeding parents for round and yellow and wrinkled and green, his F1s would be heterozygous, but they would look, their phenotype would be round and yellow, but their genotype would be heterozygous. And pause for a minute and predict what do you think the outcome would be if you crossed or allowed this F1 generation to self-pollinate. Did you pause? Okay, moving on. Well, it's a little more involved. Right, we start with the parent generation. The two purebreds are homozygous dominant or homozygous recessive for two traits. The dominant, homozygous dominant can pass on only big R, big Y, and the homozygous recessive can only pass on little r, little y. So that means F1 must be heterozygous for both traits, big R, big Y, little y. And we get this combination. There are 16 possible outcomes. And each of those with, I forget the exact ratio for the different genotypes. But the phenotypes, we end up with 9 homozygous dominants, 9 phenotypes that are dominant, yellow round, green round, 9 to 3 to 3 to 1. And this was verified by Mendel's research across many different trials, many different traits. We saw the same pattern of 9 out of 16 would look yellow and round. They'd look like the dominant traits. But he could do further tests and determine, hey, some of these are in fact heterozygous, or heterozygous for one trait and homozygous for another. We will do these in class because it's a little hard just to look at them. It just seems very complicated. But really what we want to look at is this. Grab my marker real quick. This ratio right here, this 9 to 3 to 3 to 1. And the 9, again, is the yellow rounds, the two dominant traits, right? The 9 is the two dominant traits. The 3s has one dominant trait, like round, and then a recessive trait like green. The other 3 is the opposite, where it looks yellow, the dominant trait, but is wrinkled, the recessive trait. And out of 16 possible outcomes, 1 out of 16 should look recessive and would be genetically recessive as well. So this was what he found through this independent assortment of traits. Mendel thought it would make sense that traits don't influence each other. So Darwin came up with this law of independent assortment. Factors of different traits are inherited separately from each other. So it doesn't matter, for example, if you get the yellow trait as to whether you get the round or wrinkled shape. They don't influence one another. There are traits we know of in modern genetics that kind of don't play by this rule, the linked traits, but we will worry about those when it comes to genetics too, and the second half of biology. For now, at least with pea plants, factors of different traits are inherited separately from each other. So whether you inherit the big R has no impact on whether you inherit the big Y or little y. Same thing the other direction. If you have a little y, it does not affect which R trait you get. And this was verified multiple times with the same or very close to the same ratios, which is really incredible that Mendel was able to fall upon this perfect specimen of study that followed the rules so closely. All right. So again, inheriting R has no effect on whether big Y or little y is actually, I think it's a duplicate slide. If I get bears repeating, this is the law of independent assortment. Okay. So let's summarize real quick what we say about Mendel's work. The law of segregation, parents pass on the offspring only one copy of their traits. So if they are heterozygous, big A, little a, they can only pass on big A or little a. If they're recessive, they can only pass on the recessive trait. If they're dominant, only pass on the dominant trait. This is the essence of the law of segregation. Whereas the law of independent assortment says that inheriting one trait, big A or little a, has no effect on any other trait that's inherited, big B or little b. They're independent of each other. All right, and that is it for this video. We'll practice these dihybrid crosses in class. They're kind of fun to do if you like puzzles, and see for ourselves how these work out.